So in this first video of the unit, we're going to look at credit and debt and the different ways to pay for things. And there are a few different ways. We're going to take a look at those in this video. So before we get to credit and debt, first you need to know what is a transaction. So all a transaction is that a transaction occurs when something is bought. And in every single transaction, there's always two parties. Every transaction has a buyer and a seller. So each time there's going to be a buyer and a seller, doesn't matter what is being bought and sold. So seller could be selling anything. In this case, a small transaction would be something like milk, and the buyer's paying a small amount of money for a gallon of milk. And boom, that's a completed transaction. But there's also a little bit bigger transactions. For instance, what if you're buying a car? The seller's selling a new truck, and so your buyer is going to need a little bit more money. And then the money is exchanged, buyer gets the truck, and boom, that's a completed transaction. So let's keep moving the scales up, and let's go to even bigger transaction, and this would be a very large transaction. What if you're buying a house? So the seller is selling a house, and you are the buyer, so you're going to need a lot of money for that transaction, and you end up buying the house, seller gets the money, you get the house, and boom, that's a completed transaction. So again, transactions range in scale from the very small transactions like buying a very small item at a store all the way up to buying a house, or even bigger than that, a skyscraper or some sort of building or an entire island. Those are the largest scale transactions. So we now know that transactions can range in size, but when it comes to transactions, there's really two types. There's what I call a simple transaction, and then there's a third-party transaction. So these are the two types. So a simple transaction is a transaction that is settled immediately. So you go into a store, buy something, transaction is settled. And another thing about a simple transaction is that the money used in the transaction is your money, or it's the buyer's own money that's used in the transaction. So now let's look at a third-party transaction. A third-party transaction is a transaction that involves a third-party lender. So it's not just between a buyer and a seller. That means we're bringing in a third party. And another thing to note about third-party transactions is they're not immediately settled like a simple transaction. Third-party transactions, the transaction is not completed until the full debt given by the lender is repaid. Now we're going to get into the heart of what the video is about, credit and debt. So some simple, easy to remember definitions here. Credit is just money that you borrow from a lender. So you need to make a transaction, you don't have the money up front, or it's a very big purchase, so you borrow some money from a lender to make the purchase. Debt, on the other hand, is going to be the money that you owe back to the lender. So you borrowed some money and you need to pay it back, and so debt is going to be the money that you pay back or owe the lender. And one rule of thumb here, you never want a lot of debt in any case. Ideally, if you can avoid debt, that is the best thing to do. You never want to accumulate a lot of debt. So let's look at some more examples involving transactions. And let's go back to the original example of buying a gallon of milk. So there's you are going to be the buyer, and you go to the store, who is the seller, and you're going to buy a gallon of milk. And let's say you actually have the cash on hand here. So you just go, you give them the money for the milk, and the transaction is settled. Now you own the milk, and the store gets the money. Let's look at another simple transaction where you do have the cash on hand. Let's say now, instead of just buying a gallon of milk, you're going to buy a whole cart of groceries, and it's going to be a little bit more money, but let's say you have the money, and so you can make the purchase without using a lender, and the store gets the money, you get the groceries, and that is a settled transaction. Those are simple transactions where you have the money and the transaction settled immediately. Now let's look at some that involve a third-party lender. So you go to the grocery store, and instead of buying this with cash, with your own money, let's say you buy it with your credit card. In this case, we'll say it's Visa. And so that's where a lender comes in. And in this case, your lender is going to be Visa because you're using a Visa card. And Visa has a bunch of money to lend to you. So now you go to the store, and to buy those groceries, you go up to the cashier, and instead of paying cash, you go ahead and you swipe that Visa card. So what that does is that lets Visa know you bought using their name. So what they do is they give the store the money, store gives you the groceries, and you get the groceries the exact same way as if you would have paid cash. The only thing is that Visa paid the store, not you. So why would Visa do that? Visa is not a charity. They don't just give away money. The reason they're doing it is because they're hoping to make more money off you in the future. So what they do is they draw up an agreement with you and they say you owe us, let's say the groceries were $59.62. And then you say pay us back by a certain date, or else you owe, and this is the key, you owe 10% interest on money you have not paid yet. Thanks, Visa. And they won't send you a note like that. They would just send you a bill, and it's usually in your credit card agreement. Certain date comes and you haven't paid it off. Well, now you have to pay Visa interest on that. So Visa sends that to you, and that right there is called debt. So you owe Visa debt. So let's take a little bit closer look at this agreement here. And so remember that debt is the money that you owe back to the lender. So now you are in debt to Visa. Let's take a look at this a little bit more zoomed in. We're going to look at a few things in this agreement. And so the first thing we're going to look at is something called principal. And in a debt agreement, principal is the original amount you agree to pay back. So that's just the original amount that you bought with. And so in this case, that's going to be $59.62. Then there's going to be a second thing, and this is how lenders make money, is off interest. So remember, for you, interest is good when you're investing, but in terms of debt, interest is bad because interest is the extra money you owe on top of the principal. So in this case, the interest rate is 10%, so you owe 10% of what you didn't pay back. So let's just say the year goes by, you end up not paying Visa by this date, and we're going to calculate the total debt you owe. So first, you owe the principal, which is $59.62. Now you have to figure out the interest. So times that by the rate. So the rate is 10%. So $59.62, 10% of that is going to be $5.96. So now to find the total debt owed, you just take the principal of $59.62 plus the interest of $5.96, and that's going to be the total debt. So now you owe Visa $65.58. Let's take a look at one more of these examples. So let's say you had a very big grocery bill, and now you owe $228.48. And the agreement is pay us back by February 17th, 2024, or else you owe 18% interest on money you haven't paid. Thanks, and not to pick on Visa, so let's say we use MasterCard here, a MasterCard card. So let's find the principal, then the interest, and then how much total debt we owe if, let's say, we haven't paid any of it back. So principal, in this case, is the original amount owed, which is $228.48. Interest, so we know the interest rate is going to be 18%. So now let's find the total debt because we have everything we need. So principal is going to be $228.48 multiplied by the interest rate of 18%. And so that means that we owe $41.13 of interest. And now we just add these two together, the principal of $228.48 plus the interest of $41.13. And that's going to give us our total debt here of $269.61. And so again, you got to be very careful in the future with messing with these interest rates, because once it starts getting into bigger and bigger purchases, you can see how this debt could add up fast. So one note before you go, avoid big interest on debt. You want small interest rates on small purchases. And as always, have a nice day.